Part 1 of the River Duddon by William Wordsworth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The River Duddon rises upon Wrynose Fell on the confines of Westmoreland, Cumberland and Lancashire, and serving as a boundary to the two latter counties for the space of about 25 miles, enters the Irish Sea between the Isle of Walney and the lordship of Millom. 1. Not envying shades which haply yet may throw a grateful coolness round that rocky spring Bandusia, once responsive to the string of the Horatian lyre with babbling flow, careless of flowers that in perennial blow round the moist marge of Persian fountains cling, heedless of Alpine torrents thundering through icy portals radiant as heaven's bow, I seek the birthplace of a native stream. All hail, ye mountains, hail thou morning light! Better to breathe upon this airy height than pass in needless sleep from dream to dream. Pure flow the verse, pure, vigorous, free and bright, for Duddon, long loved Duddon, is my theme. 2. Child of the clouds, remote from every taint of sordid industry, thy lot is cast. Thine are the honours of the lofty waste. Not seldom, when with heat the valleys faint, thy handmaid frost with spangled tissue quaint thy cradle decks. To chaunt thy birth, thou hast no meaner poet than the whistling blast, and desolation is thy patron saint. She guards thee, ruthless power, who would not spare these mighty forests, once the bison's screen, where stalked the huge deer to his shaggy lair, through paths and alleys roofed with sombre green, thousands of years before the silent air was pierced by whizzing shaft of hunter keen. Note: the deer alluded to is the lee, a gigantic species, long since extinct. 3. How shall I paint thee? Be this naked stone my seat, while I give way to such intent? Please could my verse, a speaking monument, make to the eyes of men thy features known. But as of all those tripping lambs not one outruns his fellows, so hath nature lent to thy beginning nought that doth present peculiar grounds for hope to build upon. To dignify the spot that gives thee birth, no sign of hoar antiquity's esteem appears, and none of modern fortune's care. Yet thou thyself hast round thee shed a gleam of brilliant moss, instinct with freshness rare, prompt offering to thy foster mother, Earth. 4. Take, cradled nursling of the mountain, take this parting glance, no negligent adieu. A Procyon change seems wrought while I pursue, the curves a loosely scattered chain doth make. Or rather, thou appear'st a glistering snake, silent, and to the gazer's eye untrue, thridding with sinuous lapse the rushes, through dwarf willows gliding, and by ferny brake. Starts from a dizzy steep the undaunted rill, robed instantly in garb of snow-white foam, and laughing dares the adventurer who hath clomb so high a rival purpose to fulfil. Else let the dastard backward wend and roam, seeking less bold achievement where he will. 5. So listener Duddon, to the breeze that played with thy clear voice, I caught the fitful sound, wafted o'er sullen moss and craggy mound, unfruitful solitudes that seemed to upbraid the sun in heaven. But now to form a shade for thee, green alders have together wound their foliage, ashes flung their arms around, and birch trees risen in silver colonnade. And thou hast also tempted here to rise, mid sheltering pines, this cottage rude and grey, whose ruddy children, by the mother's eyes carelessly watched, sport through the summer day, thy pleased associates. Light as endless May on infant bosoms lonely nature lies. 6. Ere yet our course was graced with social trees, it lacked not old remains of hawthorn bowers, where small birds warbled to their paramours, and earlier still was heard the hum of bees. I saw them ply their harmless robberies, and caught the fragrance which the sundry flowers, fed by the stream with soft perpetual showers, plenteously yielded to the vagrant breeze. There bloomed the strawberry of the wilderness, the trembling eyebright showed her sapphire blue, the thyme her purple like the blush of even, and, if the breath of some to no caress invited, forth they peeped, so fair to view, all kinds alike seemed favourites of heaven. 7. Change me, some god, into that breathing rose, the love-sick stripling fancifully sighs, the envied flower beholding as it lies on Laura's breast in exquisite repose. Or he would pass into her bird that throws the darts of song from out its wiry cage. Enraptured, could he for himself engage the thousandth part of what the nymph bestows, and what the little careless innocent ungraciously receives? Too daring choice. There are those whose calmer mind it would content to be an unculled floweret of the glen, fearless of plough and scythe, or darkling wren that tunes on Duddon's banks her slender voice. 8. What aspect bore the man who roved or fled, first of his tribe to this dark dell, who first in this pellucid current slaked his thirst? What hopes came with him? What designs were spread along his path? His unprotected bed what dreams encompassed? Was the intruder nursed in hideous usages and rites accursed, that thinned the living and disturbed the dead? No voice replies. The earth, the air, is mute. And thou, blue streamlet, murmuring yield'st no more than a soft record that whatever fruit of ignorance thou mightest witness heretofore, thy function was to heal and to restore, to soothe and cleanse, not madden and pollute. 9. The Stepping Stones, and 10. The same subject. The struggling rill insensibly is grown into a brook of loud and stately march, crossed ever and anon by plank and arch. And, for like use, lo! what might seem a zone chosen for ornament, stone matched with stone, in studied symmetry, with interspace for the clear waters to pursue their race without restraint. How swiftly have they flown! Succeeding, still succeeding. Here the child puts, when the high-swollen flood runs fierce and wild, his budding courage to the proof, and here declining manhood learns to note the sly and sure encroachments of infirmity, thinking how fast time runs, life's end how near. Not so that pair, whose youthful spirits dance with prompt emotion, urging them to pass. A sweet confusion checks the shepherd lass. Blushing, she eyes the dizzy flood askance. To stop ashamed, too timid to advance, she ventures once again, another pause. His outstretched hand he tauntingly withdraws. She sues for help with piteous utterance. Chidden, she chides again. The thrilling touch both feel when he renews the wished for aid. Ah! if their fluttering hearts should stir too much, should beat too strongly, both may be betrayed. The frolic loves who, from yon high rock, see the struggle, clap their wings for victory. 11. The Fairy Chasm. No fiction was it of the antique age. A sky-blue stone within this sunless cleft is of the very footmarks unbereft which tiny elves impressed on that smooth stage, dancing with all their brilliant equipage in secret revels, haply after theft of some sweet babe, flower stolen, and coarse weed left for the distracted mother to assuage her grief with as she might. But where, oh where, is traceable a vestige of the notes that ruled those dances, wild in character? Deep underground, or in the upper air, on the shrill wind of midnight, or where floats o'er twilight fields the autumnal gossamer? 12. Hints for the Fancy. On, loitering Muse! The swift stream chides us, on! Albeit his deep-worn channel doth immure objects immense, portrayed in miniature, wild shapes for many a strange comparison. Niagaras, Alpine passes, and anon abodes of Naiads, calm abysses pure, bright liquid mansions fashioned to endure when the broad oak drops a leafless skeleton, and the solidities of mortal pride, palace and tower, are crumbled into dust. The bard who walks with Duddon for his guide shall find such toys of fancy thickly set. Turn from the sight, enamoured Muse, we must. Leave them, and if thou canst, without regret. 13. Open Prospect. Hail to the fields! With dwellings sprinkled o'er, and one small hamlet under a green hill, clustered with barn and byre and spouting mill. A glance suffices. Should we wish for more, gay June would scorn us. But when bleak winds roar through the stiff lance-like shoots of pollard ash, dread swell of sound, loud as the gusts that lash the matted forests of Ontario's shore by wasteful steel unsmitten, then would I turn into port, and reckless of the gale, reckless of angry Duddon sweeping by, while the warm hearth exalts the mantling ale, laugh with the generous household heartily at all the merry pranks of Donnerdale. 14. O mountain stream! The shepherd and his cot are privileged inmates of deep solitude, nor would the nicest anchorite exclude a field or two of brighter green, or plot of tillage ground, that seemeth like a spot of stationary sunshine. Thou hast viewed these only, Duddon, with their paths renewed by fits and starts. Yet this contents thee not. Thee hath some awful spirit impelled to leave, utterly to desert the haunts of men, though simple thy companions were and few, and through this wilderness a passage cleave, attended but by thy own voice, save when the clouds and fowls of the air thy way pursue. 15. From this deep chasm, where quivering sunbeams play upon its loftiest crags, mine eyes behold a gloomy niche, capacious, blank, and cold, a concave free from shrubs and mosses grey, in semblance fresh, as if with dire affray some statue, placed amid these regions old for tutelary service, thence had rolled, startling the flight of timid yesterday. Was it by mortals sculptured, weary slaves of slow endeavour, or abruptly cast into rude shape by fire with roaring blast, tempestuously let loose from central caves, or fashioned by the turbulence of waves? Then, when o'er highest hills the deluge passed. 16. American Tradition. Such fruitless questions may not long beguile or plague the fancy, mid the sculptured shows, conspicuous yet where Orinoco flows. There would the Indian answer with a smile aimed at the white man's ignorance, the while of the great waters telling, how they rose, covered the plains, and wandering where they chose, mounted through every intricate defile, triumphant. Inundation wide and deep, o'er which his fathers urged, to ridge and steep, else unapproachable, their buoyant way, and carved on mural cliffs' undreaded side, sun, moon, and stars, and beast of chase or prey, whate'er they sought, shunned, loved, or deified. Note: see Humboldt's Personal Narrative. 17. Return. A dark plume fetch me from yon blasted yew, perched on whose top the Danish raven croaks. Aloft, the imperial bird of Rome invokes departed ages, shedding where he flew loose fragments of wild wailing that bestrew the clouds and thrill the chambers of the rocks, and into silence hush the timorous flocks that slept so calmly while the nightly dew moistened each fleece beneath the twinkling stars. These couched mid that lone camp on Hard Knot's height, whose guardians bent the knee to Jove and Mars, these near that mystic round of Druid frame, tardily sinking by its proper weight deep into patient earth, from whose smooth breast it came. 18. Seathwaite Chapel. Sacred religion, mother of form and fear, dread arbitress of mutable respect, new rites ordaining when the old are wrecked, or cease to please the fickle worshipper. If one strong wish may be embosomed here, mother of love, For this deep veil protect Truth's holy lamp, pure source of bright effect, gifted to purge the vapoury atmosphere that seeks to stifle it, as in those days when this low pile a Gospel teacher knew, whose good works formed an endless retinue. Such priest as Chaucer sang in fervent lays, such as the heaven-taught skill of Herbert drew, and tender Goldsmith crowned with deathless praise. 19. Tributary Stream. My frame hath often trembled with delight, when hope presented some far distant good, that seemed from heaven descending, like the flood of yon pure waters from their airy height, hurrying with lordly Duddon to unite, who mid a world of images impressed on the calm depth of his transparent breast, appears to cherish most that torrent white, the fairest, softest, liveliest of them all, and seldom hath ear listened to a tune more lulling than the busy hum of noon, swollen by that voice, whose murmur musical announces to the thirsty fields a boon, dewy and fresh, till showers again shall fall. 20. The Plain of Donnerdale. The old inventive poets, had they seen or rather felt the entrancement that detains thy waters, Duddon, mid these flowery plains, the still repose, the liquid lapse serene, transferred to bowers imperishably green, had beautified Elysium. But these chains will soon be broken. A rough course remains, rough as the past, where thou of placid mien, innocuous as a firstling of a flock, and countenanced like a soft cerulean sky, shalt change thy temper, and with many a shock given and received in mutual jeopardy, dance like a bacchanal from rock to rock, tossing her frantic thyrsus wide and high. 21. Whence that low voice? A whisper from the heart that told of days long past when here I roved, with friends and kindred tenderly beloved. Some who had early mandates to depart, yet are still allowed to steal my path athwart by Duddon's side. Once more do we unite, once more beneath the kind earth's tranquil light, and smothered joys into new being start. From her unworthy seat, the cloudy stall of time breaks forth triumphant memory, her glistening tresses bound, yet light and free as golden locks of birch, that rise and fall on gales that breathe too gently to recall aught of the fading year's inclemency. 22. Tradition. A love-lorn maid at some far distant time came to this hidden pool, whose depths surpass in crystal clearness Dian's looking-glass, and gazing saw that rose which from the prime derives its name, reflected as the chime of echo doth reverberate some sweet sound. The starry treasure from the blue profound she longed to ravish. Shall she plunge, or climb the humid precipice, and seize the guest of April smiling high in upper air? Desperate alternative! What fiend could dare to prompt the thought? Upon the steep rock's breast the lonely primrose yet renews its bloom, untouched memento of her hapless doom. 23. Sheep-washing. Sad thoughts avaunt! The fervour of the year poured on the fleece-encumbered flock invites to laving currents, for prelusive rites duly performed before the dalesmen shear their panting charge. The distant mountains hear and repeat the turmoil that unites clamour of boys with innocent despites of barking dogs and bleatings from strange fear. Meanwhile, if Duddon's spotless breast receive unwelcome mixtures, as the uncouth noise thickens, the pastoral river will forgive such wrong. Nor need we blame the licensed joys, though false to nature's quiet equipoise, frank are the sports, the stains are fugitive. 24. The Resting Place. Mid-noon is past. Upon the sultry mead no zephyr breathes, no cloud its shadow throws. If we advance unstrengthened by repose, farewell the solace of the vagrant reed. This nook, with woodbine hung and straggling weed, tempting recess as ever pilgrim chose, half grot, half arbour, proffers to enclose body and mind from molestation freed, in narrow compass, narrow as itself, Or if the fancy, too industrious elf, be loath that we should breathe awhile, exempt from new incitements friendly to our task, there wants not stealthy prospect that may tempt loose idless to forgo her wily mask. 25. Methinks 'twere no unprecedented feat, should some benignant minister of air lift and encircle with a cloudy chair the one for whom my heart shall ever beat with tenderest love; or, if a safer seat atween his downy wings be furnished, there would lodge her, and the cherished burden bear o'er hill and valley to this dim retreat. Rough ways my steps have trod, too rough and long for her companionship. Here dwells soft ease, with sweets which she partakes not, some distaste mingles, and lurking consciousness of wrong. Languish the flowers, the waters seem to waste their vocal charm, their sparklings cease to please. 26. Return content, for fondly I pursued, even when a child, the streams unheard, unseen, through tangled woods, impending rocks between, or free as air, with flying inquest viewed the sullen reservoirs whence their bold brood, pure as the morning, fretful, boisterous, keen, green as the salt sea billows, white and green, poured down the hills, a choral multitude, nor have I tracked their course for scanty gains. They taught me random cares and truant joys, that shield from mischief, and preserve from stains vague minds, while men are growing out of boys. Maturer fancy owes to their rough noise impetuous thoughts that brook not servile reins. 27. Journey renewed. I rose while yet the cattle, heat oppressed, crowded together under rustling trees, brushed by the current of the water breeze. And for their sakes, and love of all that rest on Duddon's margin in the sheltering nest, for all the startled scaly tribes that slink into his coverts, and each fearless link of dancing insects forged upon his breast, for these, and hopes and recollections worn close to the vital seat of human clay, glad meetings, tender partings, that upstay the drooping mind of absence, by vows sworn in his pure presence near the trysting thorn, I thank the leader of my onward way. 28. No record tells of lance opposed to lance, horse charging horse, mid these retired domains, nor that their turf drank purple from the veins of heroes fallen, or struggling to advance, till doubtful combat issued in a trance of victory that struck through heart and reins, even to the inmost seat of mortal pains, and lightened o'er the pallid countenance. Yet to the loyal and brave who lie in the blank earth, neglected and forlorn, the passing winds memorial tribute pay. The torrents chant their praise, inspiring scorn of power usurped, with proclamation high, and glad acknowledgment of lawful sway. 29. Who swerves from innocence, who makes divorce of that serene companion a good name, recovers not his loss, but walks with shame, with doubt, with fear, and haply with remorse. And oft times he, who, yielding to the force of chance temptation, ere his journey end, from chosen comrade turns, or faithful friend, in vain shall rue the broken intercourse. Not so with such as loosely wear the chain that binds them, pleasant river, to thy side. Through the rough copse wheel thou with hasty stride, I choose to saunter o'er the grassy plain, sure, when the separation has been tried, that we who part in love shall meet again. 30. The kirk of Ulpha to the pilgrim's eye is welcome as a star that doth present its shining forehead through the peaceful rent of a black cloud diffused o'er half the sky, or as a fruitful palm tree towering high o'er the parched waste beside an Arab's tent, or the Indian tree whose branches downward bent take root again, a boundless canopy. How sweet were leisure, could it yield no more than mid that wave-washed churchyard to recline, from pastoral graves extracting thoughts divine, or there to pace, and mark the summit's hoar Of distant moonlit mountains faintly shine, Soothed by the unseen river's gentle roar. 31 and 32. Not hurled precipitous from steep to steep, Lingering no more mid flower enamelled lands, And blooming thickets, nor by rocky bands Held, but in radiant progress toward the deep, Where mightiest rivers into powerless sleep Sink and forget their nature, now expands Majestic Duddon over smooth flat sands, Gliding in silence with unfettered sweep. Beneath an ampler sky a region wide Is opened round him, hamlets, towers, and towns, And blue-topped hills behold him from afar, In stately mien to sovereign Thames allied, Spreading his bosom under Kentish downs, With commerce freighted, or triumphant war. But here no cannon thunders to the gale, Upon the wave no haughty pendants cast A crimson splendour, lowly is the mast That rises here, and humbly spread the sail, While less disturbed than in the narrow vale Through which with strange vicissitudes he passed, The wanderer seeks that receptacle vast, Where all his unambitious functions fail. And may thy Poet, cloud-born stream, be free, The sweets of earth contentedly resigned, And each tumultuous working left behind At seemly distance, to advance like thee, Prepared in peace of heart, in calm of mind and soul, To mingle with Eternity. 33. Conclusion. I thought of thee, my partner and my guide, As being passed away. Vain sympathies! For backward, Duddon, as I cast my eyes I see what was, and is, and will abide. Still glides the stream, and shall for ever glide, The form remains, the function never dies, While we, the brave, the mighty, and the wise, We men, who in our morn of youth defied The elements, must vanish. Be it so. Enough if something from our hands have power To live and act and serve the future hour. And if as toward the silent tomb we go, Through love, through hope, and faith's transcendent dower, We feel that we are greater than we know. Postscript. A poet whose works are not yet known as they deserve to be, thus enters upon his description of the ruins of Rome. The rising sun flames on the ruins in the purer air towering aloft, and ends thus: The setting sun displays his visible great round Between yon towers, as through two shady cliffs. Mr. Crowe, in his excellent loco-descriptive poem, Lewiston Hill, is still more expeditious, finishing the whole on a May morning before breakfast. To-morrow for severer thought, but now to breakfast, and keep festival to-day. No one believes, or is desired to believe, that these poems were actually composed within such limits of time, nor was there any reason why a prose statement should acquaint the reader with the plain fact, to the disturbance of poetic credibility. But in the present case I am compelled to mention that the above series of sonnets was the growth of many years. The one which stands the 14th was the first produced, and others were added upon occasional visits to the stream, or as recollections of the scenes upon its banks awakened a wish to describe them. In this manner I had proceeded insensibly, without perceiving that I was trespassing upon ground preoccupied, at least as far as intention went, by Mr. Coleridge, who more than 20 years ago used to speak of writing a rural poem, to be entitled The Brook, of which he has given a sketch in a recent publication. But a particular subject cannot, I think, much interfere with a general one, and I have been further kept from encroaching upon any right Mr. C. may still wish to exercise, by the restriction which the frame of the sonnet imposed upon me, narrowing unavoidably the range of thought, and precluding, though not without its advantages, many graces to which a freer movement of verse would naturally have led. May I not venture then to hope that, instead of being a hindrance, by anticipation of any part of the subject, these sonnets may remind Mr. Coleridge of his own more comprehensive design, and induce him to fulfil it? There is a sympathy in streams. One calleth to another, and I would gladly believe that the brook will ere long murmur in concert with the Duddon. But asking pardon for this fancy, I need not scruple to say that those verses must indeed be ill-fated which can enter upon such pleasant walks of nature without receiving and giving inspiration. The power of waters over the minds of poets has been acknowledged from the earliest ages. Through the Flumina amem silvasque inglorious of Virgil, down to the sublime apostrophe to the great rivers of the earth by Armstrong, and the simple ejaculation of Burns, chosen, if I recollect right, by Mr. Coleridge as a motto for his embryo brook. The Muse nae poet ever fand her, till by himsel he learned to wander adown some trotting Burns meander, and na think lang. When first published in 1820, the River Duddon series consisted of 33 sonnets. Later editions included a 34th. This reading is of the sonnet listed as number 27 in Volume 3 of the 6th-volume Poetical Works, published in 1870. 27. Fallen and diffused into a shapeless heap, or quietly self-buried in earth's mould, is that embattled house, whose massy keep flung from yon cliff a shadow large and cold. There dwelt the gay, the bountiful, the bold, till nightly lamentations, like the sweep of winds, though winds were silent, struck a deep and lasting terror through that ancient hold. Its line of warriors fled, they shrunk when tried by ghostly power, but Time's unsparing hand hath plucked such foes like weeds from out the land. And now if men with men in peace abide, all other strength the weakest may withstand, all worse assaults may safely be defied. End of Part 1. Part 2 of the River Duddon Sonnets by William Wordsworth. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Notes. Sonnet 6. There bloomed the strawberry of the wilderness, the trembling eyebright showed her sapphire blue. These two lines are in a great measure taken from The Beauties of Spring, a juvenile poem by the Reverend Joseph Simpson, author of The Vision of Alfred, etc. He was a native of Cumberland and was educated in the Vale of Grasmere and at Hawkshead School. His poems are little known, but they contain passages of splendid description, and the versification of his Vision of Alfred is harmonious and animated. The present severe season, with its amusements, reminds me of some lines which I will transcribe as a favourable specimen. In describing the motions of the sylphs that constitute the strange machinery of his Vision of Alfred, he uses the following illustrative simile. Glancing from their plumes, a changeful light the azure vault illumes. Less varying hues beneath the pole adorn the streamy glories of the boreal morn, that wavering to and fro their radiance shed on Bothnia's gulf with glassy ice o'erspread, where the lone native, as he homeward glides on polished sandals o'er the imprisoned tides, and still the balance of his frame preserves, wheeled on alternate foot in lengthening curves, sees at a glance above him and below two rival heavens with equal splendour glow. Sphered in the centre of the world he seems, for all around with soft effulgence gleams. Stars, moons, and meteors ray opposed to ray, and solemn midnight pours the blaze of day. He was a man of ardent feeling, and his faculties of mind, particularly his memory, were extraordinary. Brief notices of his life ought to find a place in the history of Westmoreland. Sonnet 17. The eagle requires a large domain for its support, but several pairs not many years ago were constantly resident in this country, building their nests in the steeps of Borrowdale, Wastdale, Ennerdale, and on the eastern side of Helvellyn. Often have I heard anglers speak of the grandeur of their appearance as they hovered over Red Tarn in one of the coves of this mountain. The bird frequently returns, but is always destroyed. Not long since one visited Rydal Lake, and remained some hours near its banks. The consternation which it occasioned among the different species of fowl, particularly the herons, was expressed by loud screams. The horse also is naturally afraid of the eagle. There were several Roman stations among these mountains. The most considerable seems to have been in a meadow at the head of Windermere, established undoubtedly as a check over the passes of Kirkstone, Dunmail Rise, and of Hardknott and Wrynose. On the margin of Rydal Lake, a coin of Trajan was discovered very lately. The Roman fort here alluded to, called by the country people Hardknott Castle, is most impressively situated half-way down the hill on the right of the road that descends from Hardknott into Eskdale. It has escaped the notice of most antiquarians, and is but slightly mentioned by licence. The Druidical Circle is about half a mile to the left of the road ascending Stoneside from the Vale of Duddon. The country people call it Sunken Church. The reader who may have been interested in the foregoing sonnets, which together may be considered as a poem, will not be displeased to find in this place a prose account of the Duddon, extracted from Green's comprehensive Guide to the Lakes, lately published. The road leading from Coniston to Broughton is over high ground, and commands a view of the River Duddon, which at high water is a grand sight, having the beautiful and fertile lands of Lancashire and Cumberland stretching each way from its margin. In this extensive view, the face of nature is displayed in a wonderful variety of hill and dale, wooded grounds and buildings. Amongst the latter, Broughton Tower, seated on the crown of a hill, rising elegantly from the valley, is an object of extraordinary interest. Fertility on each side is gradually diminished, and lost in the superior heights of Blackcombe in Cumberland, and the high lands between Kirby and Ulverston. The road from Broughton to Seathwaite is on the banks of the Duddon, and on its Lancashire side it is of various elevations. The river is an amusing companion, one while brawling and tumbling over rocky precipices, until the agitated water becomes again calm by arriving at a smoother and less precipitous bed, but its course is soon again ruffled, and the current thrown into every variety of form which the rocky channel of a river can give to water. Vide Green's Guide to the Lakes, Volume 1, pages 98 to 100. After all, the traveller would be most gratified who should approach this beautiful stream, neither at its source, as is done in the sonnets, nor from its termination, but from Coniston over Walna Scar, first descending into a little circular valley, a collateral compartment of the long winding vale through which flows the Duddon. This recess, towards the close of September, when the after grass of the meadows is still of a fresh green, with the leaves of many of the trees faded, but perhaps none fallen, is truly enchanting. At a point elevated enough to show the various objects in the valley, and not so high as to diminish their importance, the stranger will instinctively halt. On the foreground, a little below the most favourable station, a rude footbridge is thrown over the bed of the noisy brook, foaming by the wayside. Russet and craggy hills of bold and varied outline surround the level valley, which is besprinkled with grey rocks plumed with birch trees. A few homesteads are interspersed in some places, peeping out from among the rocks like hermitages, whose site has been chosen for the benefit of sunshine as well as shelter. In other instances, the dwelling-house, barn, and byre compose together a cruciform structure, which, with its embowering trees, and the ivy clothing part of the walls and roof, like a fleece, call to mind the remains of an ancient abbey. Time in most cases, and nature everywhere, have given a sanctity to the humble works of man that are scattered over this peaceful retirement. Hence a harmony of tone and colour, a perfection and consummation of beauty, which would have been marred had aim or purpose interfered with the course of convenience, utility, or necessity. This unvitiated region stands in no need of the veil of twilight to soften or disguise its features. As it glistens in the morning sunshine, it would fill the spectator's heart with gladsomeness. Looking from our chosen station, he would feel an impatience to rove among its pathways, to be greeted by the milkmaid, to wander from house to house, exchanging good morrows as he passed the open doors. But at evening, when the sun is set, and a pearly light gleams from the western quarter of the sky, with an answering light from the smooth surface of the meadows, when the trees are dusky but each kind still distinguishable, when the cool air has condensed the blue smoke rising from the cottage chimneys, when the dark mossy stones seem to sleep in the bed of the foaming brook, then he would be unwilling to move forward, not less from a reluctance to relinquish what he beholds, than from an apprehension of disturbing, by his approach, the quietness beneath him. Issuing from the plain of this valley, the brook descends in a rapid torrent, passing by the churchyard of Seathwaite. The traveller is thus conducted at once into the midst of the wild and beautiful scenery which gave occasion to the Sonnets from the 14th to the 20th inclusive. From the point where the Seathwaite brook joins the Duddon is a view upwards into the pass through which the river makes its way into the plain of Donnerdale. The perpendicular rock on the right bears the ancient British name of the Pen. The one opposite is called Wallabarrow Crag, a name that occurs in several places to designate rocks of the same character. The chaotic aspect of the scene is well marked by the expression of a stranger, who strolled out while dinner was preparing, and at his return being asked by his host what way had he been wandering, replied, "As far as it is finished." The bed of Duddon is here strewn with large fragments of rock fallen from aloft, which, as Mr. Green truly says, are happily adapted to the many-shaped waterfalls, or rather water breaks, for none of them are high, displayed in the short space of half a mile. That there is some hazard in frequenting these desolate places, I myself have had proof. For one night an immense mass of rock fell upon the very spot where, with a friend, I had lingered the day before. The concussion, says Mr. Green, speaking of the event, for he also in the practice of his art on that day sat exposed for a still longer time to the same peril, was heard, not without alarm, by the neighbouring shepherds. But to return to Seathwaite churchyard, it contains the following inscription: "In memory of the Reverend Robert Walker, who died the 25th of June 1802, in the 93rd year of his age, and 67th of his curacy at Seathwaite. Also of Anne his wife, who died the 24th of January, in the 93rd year of her age." In the parish register of Seathwaite Chapel is this notice: "Buried, June 28th, the Reverend Robert Walker. He was curate of Seathwaite 66 years. He was a man singular for his temperance, industry, and integrity." The individual is the pastor alluded to in the 18th sonnet as a worthy compeer of the country parson of Chaucer, etc. An abstract of his character is given in the author's poem of The Excursion, and some account of his life, for it is worthy of being recorded, will not be out of place here. Memoir of the Reverend Robert Walker. In the year 1709, Robert Walker was born at Undercrag in Seathwaite. He was the youngest of 12 children. His eldest brother, who inherited the small family estate, died at Undercrag, aged 94, being 24 years older than the subject of this memoir, who was born of the same mother. Robert was a sickly infant, and through his boyhood and youth continuing to be of delicate frame and tender health, it was deemed best, according to the country phrase, to breed him a scholar, for it was not likely that he would be able to earn a livelihood by bodily labour. At that period few of these dales were furnished with schoolhouses, the children being taught to read and write in the chapel, and in the same consecrated building where he officiated for so many years, both as preacher and schoolmaster, he himself received the rudiments of his education. In his youth he became schoolmaster at Loweswater, not being called upon probably in that situation to teach more than reading, writing, and arithmetic. But by the assistance of a gentleman in the neighbourhood, he acquired at leisure hours a knowledge of the classics, and became qualified for taking holy orders. Upon his ordination he had the offer of 2 curacies, the one, Torver, in the Vale of Coniston, the other, Seathwaite, in his native vale. The value of each was the same, viz. £5 per annum, but the cure of Seathwaite having a cottage attached to it, as he wished to marry, he chose it in preference. The young person on whom his affections were fixed, though in the condition of a domestic servant, had given promise, by her serious and modest deportment, and by her virtuous dispositions, that she was worthy to become the helpmate of a man entering upon a plan of life such as he had marked out for himself. By her frugality she had stored up a small sum of money, with which they began housekeeping. In 1735 or 1736 he entered upon his curacy, and 19 years afterwards his situation is thus described in some letters to be found in the Annual Register for 1760, from which the following is extracted: "Sir, Coniston, July 26th, 1754. I was the other day upon a party of pleasure, about 5 or 6 miles from this place, where I met with a very striking object, and of a nature not very common. Going into a clergyman's house, of whom I had frequently heard, I found him sitting at the head of a long square table, such as is commonly used in this country by the lower class of people. Dressed in a coarse blue frock, trimmed with black horn buttons, a check shirt, a leathern strap about his neck for a stock, a coarse apron, and a pair of great wooden soled shoes, plated with iron to preserve them, what we call clogs in these parts, with a child upon his knee, eating his breakfast. His wife and the remainder of his children were some of them employed in waiting on each other, the rest in teasing and spinning wool, at which trade he is a great proficient. And moreover, when it is made ready for sale, he will lay it by 16 or 32 pounds weight upon his back, and on foot 7 or 8 miles will carry it to the market, even in the depth of winter. I was not much surprised at all this, as you may possibly be, having heard a great deal of it related before, but I must confess myself astonished with the alacrity and the good humour that appeared both in the clergyman and his wife, and more so at the sense and ingenuity of the clergyman himself. Then follows a letter from another person, dated 1755, from which an extract shall be given. By his frugality and good management he keeps the wolf from the door, as we say, and if he advances a little in the world, it is owing more to his own care than to anything else he has to rely upon. I don't find his inclination is running after further preferment. He is settled among the people that are happy among themselves, and lives in the greatest unanimity and friendship with them, and I believe the minister and people are exceedingly satisfied with each other, and indeed how should they be dissatisfied when they have a person of so much worth and probity for their pastor, a man who, for his candour and meekness, his sober, chaste and virtuous conversation, his soundness in principle and practice, is an ornament to his profession, and an honour to the country he is in. And bear with me if I say, the plainness of his dress, the sanctity of his manners, the simplicity of his doctrine, and the vehemence of his expression, have a sort of resemblance to the pure practice of primitive Christianity. We will now give his own account of himself, to be found in the same place. From the Reverend Robert Walker. Sir, yours of the 26th instant was communicated to me by Mr. C., and I should have returned an immediate answer, but the hand of Providence then lying heavy upon an amiable pledge of conjugal endearment, hath since taken from me a promising girl, which the disconsolate mother too pensively laments the loss of, though we have yet 8 living, all healthful, hopeful children, whose names and ages are as follows: Zacchaeus, aged almost 18 years, Elizabeth 16 years and 10 months, Mary 15, Moses 13 years and 3 months, Sarah 10 years and 3 months, Mabel 8 years and 3 months, William Tyson 3 years and 8 months, and Anne Esther 1 year and 3 months, besides Anne, who died 2 years and 6 months ago, and was then aged between 9 and 10, and Eleanor, who died the 23rd inst. January, aged 6 years and 10 months. Zacchaeus, the eldest child, is now learning the trade of tanner, and has 2 years and a half of his apprenticeship to serve. The annual income of my chapel at present, as near as I can compute it, may amount to about £17 10s, of which is paid in cash, viz. £5 from the bounty of Queen Anne, and £5 from W.P. Esquire, of P., out of the annual rents, he being lord of the manor, and £3 from the several inhabitants of L., settled upon the tenements as a rent charge. The house and gardens I value at £4 yearly, and not worth more, and, I believe the surplus fees and voluntary contributions, one year with another, may be worth £3. But as the inhabitants are few in number, and the fees very low, this last mentioned sum consists merely in free will offerings. I am situated greatly to my satisfaction with regard to the conduct and behaviour of my auditory, who not only live in the happy ignorance of the follies and vices of the age, but in mutual peace and good will with one another, and are seemingly, I hope really too, sincere Christians, and sound members of the established Church. not one dissenter of any denomination being amongst them all. I got to the value of £40 for my wife's fortune, but had no real estate of my own, being the youngest son of 12 children, born of obscure parents, and though my income has been but small, and my family large, yet by a providential blessing upon my own diligent endeavours, the kindness of friends, and a cheap country to live in, we have always had the necessaries of life. By what I have written, which is a true and exact account to the best of my knowledge, I hope you will not think your favour to me, out of the late worthy Dr. Stratford's effects, quite misbestowed, for which I must ever gratefully own myself, Sir, your much obliged and most obedient humble servant, R.W., Curate of S., to Mr. C. of Lancaster. About the time when this letter was written, the Bishop of Chester recommended the scheme of joining the curacy of Ulpha to the contiguous one of Seathwaite, and the nomination was offered to Mr. Walker, but an unexpected difficulty arising, Mr. W., in a letter to the Bishop, a copy of which, in his own beautiful handwriting, now lies before me, thus expresses himself: "If he," meaning the person in whom the difficulty originated, "had suggested any such objection before, I should utterly have declined any attempt to the curacy of Ulpha. Indeed, I was always apprehensive it might be disagreeable to my auditory at Seathwaite, as they have been always accustomed to double duty, and the inhabitants of Ulpha despair of being able to support a schoolmaster who is not curate there also, which suppressed all thoughts in me of serving them both." And in a second letter to the Bishop he writes: "My Lord, I have the favour of yours of the 1st inst., and am exceedingly obliged on account of the Ulpha affair. If that curacy should lapse into your Lordship's hands, I would beg leave rather to decline than embrace it, for the chapels of Seathwaite and Ulpha annexed together would be apt to cause a general discontent among the inhabitants of both places, by either thinking themselves slighted, being only served alternately or neglected in the duty, or attributing it to covetousness in me, all which occasions of murmuring I would willingly avoid." And in concluding his former letter he expresses a similar sentiment upon the same occasion: "Desiring, if it be possible, however, as much as in me lieth, to live peaceably with all men." The year following, the curacy of Seathwaite was again augmented, and to effect this augmentation £50 had been advanced by himself, and in 1760 lands were purchased with £800. Scanty as was his income, the frequent offer of much better benefices could not tempt Mr. W. to quit a situation where he had been so long happy with a consciousness of being useful. Among his papers I find the following copy of a letter dated 1775, 20 years after his refusal of the curacy of Ulpha, which will show what exertions had been made for one of his sons. "May it please your Grace, our remote situation here makes it difficult to get the necessary information for transacting business regularly. Such is the reason of my giving your Grace the present trouble. The bearer, my son, is desirous of offering himself candidate for deacon's orders at your Grace's ensuing ordination, the first on the 25th inst., so that his papers could not be transmitted in due time. As he is now fully at age, and I have afforded him education to the utmost of my ability, it would give me great satisfaction, if your Grace would take him and find him qualified, to have him ordained. His constitution has been tender for some years. He entered the College of Dublin, but his health would not permit him to continue there, or I would have supported him much longer. He has been with me at home above a year, in which time he has gained great strength of body, sufficient I hope to enable him for performing the function. Divine Providence, assisted by liberal benefactors, has blessed my endeavours from a small income to rear a numerous family, and as my time of life renders me now unfit for much future expectancy from this world, I should be glad to see my son settled in a promising way to acquire an honest livelihood for himself. His behaviour so far in life has been irreproachable, and I hope he will not degenerate, in principles or practice, from the precepts and pattern of an indulgent parent. Your Grace's favourable reception of this, from a distant corner of the diocese, and an obscure hand, will excite filial gratitude, and a due use shall be made of the obligation vouchsafed thereby to your Grace's very dutiful and most obedient Son and Servant, Robert Walker. The same man who was thus liberal in the education of his numerous family was even munificent in hospitality as a parish priest. Every Sunday were served, upon the long table at which he has been described sitting with a child upon his knee, messes of broth for the refreshment of those of his congregation who came from a distance, and usually took their seats as parts of his own household. It seems scarcely possible that this custom could have commenced before the augmentation of his cure, and what would to many have been a high price of self-denial was paid by the pastor and his family for this gratification, as the treat could only be provided by dressing at one time the whole, perhaps, of their weekly allowance of fresh animal food. Consequently, for a succession of days, the table was covered with cold victuals only. His generosity in old age may be still further illustrated by a little circumstance relating to an orphan grandson, then 10 years of age, which I find in a copy of a letter to one of his sons. He requests that half a guinea may be left for little Robert's pocket money, who was then at school, entrusting it to the care of a lady, who, as he says, may sometimes frustrate his squandering it away foolishly, and promising to send him an equal allowance annually for the same purpose. The conclusion of the same letter is so characteristic that I cannot forbear to transcribe it. We, meaning his wife and himself, are in our wonted state of health, allowing for the hasty strides of old age knocking daily at our door, and threateningly telling us, we are not only mortal, but must expect ere long to take our leave of our ancient cottage, and lie down in our last dormitory. Pray pardon my neglect to answer yours. Let us hear sooner from you, to augment the mirth of the Christmas holidays. Wishing you all the pleasures of the approaching season, I am, dear son, with lasting sincerity, yours affectionately, Robert Walker. He loved old customs and usages, and in some instances stuck to them to his own loss, for having had a sum of money lodged in the hands of a neighbouring tradesman, when long course of time had raised the rate of interest, and more was offered, he refused to accept it, an act not difficult to one who, while he was drawing £17 a year from his curacy, declined, as we have seen, to add the profits of another small benefice to his own, lest he should be suspected of cupidity. From this vice he was utterly free. He made no charge for teaching school. Such as could afford to pay gave him what they pleased. When very young, having kept a diary of his expenses, however trifling, the large amount at the end of the year surprised him, and from that time the rule of his life was to be economical, not avaricious. At his decease he left behind him no less a sum than £2,000, and such a sense of his various excellencies was prevalent in the country, that the epithet of Wonderful is to this day attached to his name. There is in the above sketch something so extraordinary as to require further explanatory details. And to begin with his industry. 8 hours in each day, during 5 days of the week, and half of Saturday, except when the labours of husbandry were urgent, he was occupied in teaching. His seat was within the rails of the altar, the communion table was his desk, and like Shenstone's schoolmistress, the master employed himself at the spinning wheel, while the children were repeating their lessons by his side. Every evening after school hours, if not more profitably engaged, he continued the same kind of labour, exchanging for the benefit of exercise the small wheel at which he had sat for the large one on which wool is spun, the spinner stepping to and fro. Thus was the wheel constantly in readiness to prevent the waste of a moment's time. Nor was his industry with the pen, when occasion called for it, less eager. Entrusted with extensive management of public and private affairs, he acted in his rustic neighbourhood as scrivener, writing out petitions, deeds of conveyance, wills, covenants, etc., with pecuniary gain to himself and to the great benefit of his employers. These labours, at all times considerable, at one period of the year, viz. Between Christmas and Candlemas, when money transactions are settled in this country, were often so intense that he passed great part of the night, and sometimes whole nights, at his desk. His garden also was tilled by his own hand. He had a right of pasturage upon the mountains, for a few sheep and a couple of cows, which required his attendance. With this pastoral occupation he joined the labours of husbandry upon a small scale, renting 2 or 3 acres in addition to his own less than 1 acre of glebe ; and the humblest drudgery which the cultivation of these fields required was performed by himself. He also assisted his neighbours in haymaking and shearing their flocks, and in the performance of this latter service he was eminently dexterous. They in their turn complimented him with a present of a haycock or a fleece, less as a recompense for this particular service than as a general acknowledgment. The Sabbath was in a strict sense kept holy, the Sunday evenings being devoted to reading the Scripture and family prayer. The principal festivals appointed by the Church were also duly observed, but through every other day in the week, through every other week in the year, he was incessantly occupied in work of hand or mind, not allowing a moment for recreation, except upon a Saturday afternoon, when he indulged himself with a newspaper, or sometimes with a magazine. The frugality and temperance established in his house were as admirable as the industry. Nothing to which the name of luxury could be given was there known. In the latter part of his life, indeed, when tea had been brought into almost general use, it was provided for visitors, and for such of his own family as returned occasionally to his roof, and had been accustomed to this refreshment elsewhere, but neither he nor his wife ever partook of it. The raiment worn by his family was comely and decent, but as simple as their diet. The homespun materials were made up into apparel by their own hands. At the time of the decease of this thrifty pair, their cottage contained a large store of webs of woollen and linen cloth, woven from thread of their own spinning, and it is remarkable that the pew in the chapel in which the family used to sit remained a few years ago neatly lined with woollen cloth spun by the pastor's own hands. It is the only pew in the chapel so distinguished, and I know of no other instance of his conformity to the delicate accommodations of modern times. The fuel of the house, like that of their neighbours, consisted of peat, procured from the mosses by their own labour. The lights, by which in the winter evenings their work was performed, were of their own manufacture, such as still continue to be used in these cottages. They are made of the pith of rushes, dipped in any unctuous substance that the house affords. White candles, as tallow candles are here called, were reserved to honour the Christmas festivals, and were perhaps produced upon no other occasions. Once a month during the proper season, a sheep was drawn from their small mountain flock, and killed for the use of the family, and a cow towards the close of the year was salted and dried for winter provision. The hide was tanned to furnish them with shoes. By these various resources, this venerable clergyman reared a numerous family, not only preserving them, as he affectingly says, from wanting the necessaries of life, but afforded them an unstinted education, and the means of raising themselves in society. It might have been concluded that no one could thus, as it were, have converted his body into a machine of industry for the humblest uses, and kept his thoughts so frequently bent upon secular concerns, without grievous injury to the most precious parts of his nature. How could the powers of intellect thrive, or its graces be displayed in the midst of circumstances apparently so unfavourable, and where to the direct cultivation of the mind so small a portion of time was allotted? But in this extraordinary man, things in their nature adverse were reconciled. His conversation was remarkable, not only for being chaste and pure, but for the degree in which it was fervent and eloquent. His written style was correct, simple, and animated, nor did his affections suffer more than his intellect. He was tenderly alive to all the duties of his pastoral office. The poor and needy he never sent empty away. The stranger was fed and refreshed in passing that unfrequented vale. The sick were visited, and the feelings of humanity found further exercise among the distresses and embarrassments in the worldly estate of his neighbours, with which his talents for business made him acquainted, and the disinterestedness, impartiality, and uprightness which he maintained in the management of all affairs confided to him, were virtues seldom separated in his own conscience from religious obligations. Nor could such conduct fail to remind those who witnessed it of a spirit nobler than law or custom. They felt convictions which, but for such intercourse, could not have been afforded. That, as in the practice of their pastor, there was no guile, so in his faith there was nothing hollow; and we are warranted in believing that, upon these occasions, selfishness, obstinacy, and discord would often give way before the breathings of his good will and saintly integrity. It may be presumed also, while his humble congregation were listening to the moral precepts which he delivered from the pulpit, and to the Christian exhortations that they should love their neighbour as themselves, and do as they would be done unto, that particular efficacy was given to the preacher's labours by recollections in the minds of his congregation, that they were called upon to do no more than his own actions were daily setting before their eyes. The afternoon service in the chapel was less numerously attended than that of the morning, but by a more serious auditory. The lesson from the New Testament on those occasions was accompanied by Burkitt's commentaries. These lessons he read with impassioned emphasis, frequently drawing tears from his hearers, and leaving a lasting impression upon their minds. His devotional feelings and the powers of his own mind were further exercised, along with those of his family, in perusing the Scriptures, not only on the Sunday evenings, but on every other evening, while the rest of the household were at work. Some one of the children, and in her turn the servant, for the sake of practice in reading, or for instruction, read the Bible aloud, and in this manner the whole was repeatedly gone through. That no common importance was attached to the observance of religious ordinances by his family appears from the following memorandum by one of his descendants, which I am tempted to insert at length, as it is characteristic and somewhat curious. There is a small chapel in the County Palatine of Lancaster, where a certain clergyman has regularly officiated above 60 years, and a few months ago administered the sacrament of the Lord's Supper in the same to a decent number of devout communicants. After the clergyman had received himself, the first company out of the assembly who approached the altar, and kneeled down to be partakers of the sacred elements, consisted of the parson's wife, to whom he had been married upwards of 60 years, one son and his wife, 4 daughters, each with her husband, whose ages all added together amount to above 714 years. The several and respective distances from the place of each of their abodes to the chapel where they all communicated will measure more than 1000 English miles. Though the narration will appear surprising, it is without doubt a fact that the same persons, exactly 4 years before, met at the same place, and all joined in performance of the same venerable duty. He was indeed most zealously attached to the doctrine and frame of the established Church. We have seen him congratulating himself that he had no dissenters in his cure of any denomination. Some allowance must be made for the state of opinion when his first religious impressions were received, before the reader will acquit him of bigotry, when I mention that at the time of the augmentation of the cure, he refused to invest part of the money in the purchase of an estate offered to him upon advantageous terms, because the proprietor was a Quaker, whether from scrupulous apprehension that a blessing would not attend a contract framed for the benefit of the Church between persons not in religious sympathy with each other, or, as a seeker of peace, he was afraid of the uncomplying disposition which at one time was too frequently conspicuous in that sect. Of this, an instance had fallen under his own notice, for while he taught school at Loweswater, certain persons of that denomination had refused to pay or be distrained upon for the accustomed annual interest due from them, among others, under the title of church stock. A great hardship upon the incumbent, for the curacy of Loweswater was then scarcely less poor than that of Seathwaite. To what degree this prejudice of his was blameable need not be determined. Certain it is that he was not only desirous, as he himself says, to live in peace, but in love with all men. He was placable and charitable in his judgments, and however correct in conduct and rigorous to himself, he was ever ready to forgive the trespasses of others, and to soften the censure that was cast upon their frailties. It would be unpardonable to admit that in the maintenance of his virtues he received due support from the partner of his long life. She was equally strict in attending to her share of their joint cares, nor less diligent in her appropriate occupations. A person who had been some time their servant in the latter part of their lives concluded the panegyric of her mistress by saying to me, she was no less excellent than her husband. She was good to the poor, she was good to everything. He survived for a short time this virtuous companion. When she died, he ordered that her body should be borne to the grave by 3 of her daughters and 1 granddaughter, and when the corpse was lifted from the threshold, he insisted upon lending his aid, and feeling about, for he was then almost blind, took hold of a napkin fixed to the coffin, and, as a bearer of the body, entered the chapel a few steps from the lowly parsonage. What a contrast does the life of this obscurely seated, and in point of worldly wealth, poorly repaid churchman present to that of a Cardinal Wolsey! Oh, 'tis a burthen, Cromwell, 'tis a burthen too heavy for a man who hopes for heaven. We have been dwelling upon images of peace in the moral world, that have brought us again to the quiet enclosure of consecrated ground, in which this venerable pair lie interred. The sounding brook, that rolls close by the churchyard without disturbing feeling or meditation, is now unfortunately laid bare, but not long ago it participated, with the chapel, the shade of some stately ash trees which will not spring again. While the spectator from this spot is looking round upon the girdle of stony mountains that encompasses the vale, masses of rock, out of which monuments for all men that ever existed might have been hewn, it would surprise him to be told, as with truth he might be, that the plain blue slab dedicated to the memory of this aged pair is a production of a quarry in North Wales. It was sent as a mark of respect by one of their descendants from the Vale of Festiniog, a region almost as beautiful as that in which it now lies. Upon the Seathwaite brook, at a small distance from the parsonage, has been erected a mill for spinning yarn. It is a mean and disagreeable object, though not unimportant to the spectator, as calling to mind the momentous changes wrought by such inventions in the frame of society, changes which have proved especially unfavourable to these mountain solitudes. So much had been effected by those new powers before the subject of the preceding biographical sketch closed his life, that their operation could not escape his notice, and doubtless excited touching reflections upon the comparatively insignificant results of his own manual industry. But Robert Walker was not a man of times and circumstances. Had he lived at a later period, the principle of duty would have produced application as unremitting. The same energy of character would have been displayed, though in many instances with widely different effects. Having mentioned in this narrative the Vale of Loweswater as a place where Mr. Walker taught school, I will add a few memorandums from its parish register respecting a person, apparently of desires as moderate, with whom he must have been intimate during his residence there. Let him that would ascend the tottering seat of courtly grandeur, and become as great as are his mounting wishes. But for me, let sweet repose and rest my portion be. Henry Forest, Curate. Honour, the idol which the most adore, receives no homage from my knee. Content in privacy I value more than all uneasy dignity. Henry Forest came to Loweswater 1708, being 25 years of age. This curacy was twice augmented by Queen Anne's bounty. The first payment, with great difficulty, was paid to Mr. John Curwen of London on the 9th of May 1724, deposited by me, Henry Forest, curate of Loweswater. The said 9th of May, the said Mr. Curwen went to the office and saw my name registered there, etc. This, by the providence of God, came by lot to this poor place. Haec testor, H. Forest. In another place he records that the sycamore trees were planted in the churchyard in 1710. He died in 1741, having been curate 34 years. It is not improbable that H. Forest was the gentleman who assisted Robert Walker in his classical studies at Loweswater. To this parish register is prefixed a motto, of which the following verses are part. Invigilati viri, tacito nam tempora gressu, diffugiunt nulloque sono convertitur annus, utendum est etate, sito pede praeteritates. Sonnet 33. We feel that we are greater than we know, and feel that I am happier than I know. Milton. The allusion to the Greek poet will be obvious to the classical reader. End of the River Duddon Sonnets by William Wordsworth.